welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your other co-host, Matt Bernico.
Matt, we're talking so much about monasteries and communes, and I thought I'd just take you again down to the basement of the Christian Family Life Center, to the Bone Church, and show you the new wing that I'm working on with a handful of very dedicated teens. This is the Bone Commune wing. And we haven't quite figured out the branding. I feel like there's some mixed messages, but I gotta tell you, the teens, they're so psyched about both of these ideas, just like me, and we can't seem to pull them apart. Mostly so far, it's just kind of a place to like stash the t-shirts we don't want anymore, or kind of like old pizza that we're willing to give up. But I feel like over time, it's going to become a really good mutual aid space for the youth. And I just thought I'd, get your first impressions on the new wing here at the Bone Church downstairs.
Wow, just like in the Book of Acts, just like the early Christians, they shared all of their possessions, they sold their property and pooled their money, and just in that same spirit, you are putting the pizza and t-shirts down there for the people who need them. Wow. Truly a biblical Christian community.
Yeah, all the allowances are coming together, and they can't buy much, but I think what they're trying to do is get one communal beanbag chair. That's their first experiment here in a group fundraiser, and I think they're going to do it.
There's nothing, I think, I like the idea of monasteries. That's cool. Monasteries as commons, as we talked about in the last episode, is an exciting idea to me, sort of creating that type of intentional community to manage resources and labor and production. That is cool. An intentional Christian community is the scariest thing I can imagine, though. Like the one that's not sort of monastery based, that is terrifying to me. The one where I would have to live with my youth group friends, and we'd all have to argue about who does the dishes. Now that one's scary. I don't like that idea. I'm trying to do
the compulsory land party makes it hard.
That's right. Yeah, the compulsory land party followed by a Bible study is the scary part. I'm trying to sort of like parse out the differences between these two things in my brain, and I'm having a hard time sorting it out exactly. One is Catholic and one is Protestant, and the Protestant one is bad, I guess, is all I'm kind of coming up with.
That's right. Inching closer and closer to crossing the Tiber, which will be your destiny one day for sure. But don't worry, we're all patient over here in the Roman Catholic Church. Folks, we're not talking about monasteries, but we are still talking about communes this time around. For a while we were talking about garbage. I guess we stopped for no particular reason. And now our interests have led us down some other tributary, some other incredibly weird branching path of our brains. And now we're on a commune kick for some reason or other. And I think, maybe it was, in the last episode, Matt mentioned that the Monthly Review did a great, big, huge summer issue on communes. And it's really interesting. I read it when it came out, and then, I don't know, forgot about it, like you do with everything you get by subscription. And I thought it would be fun to look at it again, and we read a little bit from it. I feel like I've also been trying to work out how to, like, square the insights around Christian communes and monasteries and so on with contemporary socialism. So I guess we don't really have a thesis per se for this article, or for this episode, except that we're going to do our best to put it all together, or not. We're gonna talk about it and figure out whether or not they go together, but our brains have just been steeped in the monastery, and now we're allowing them to emerge into more contemporary modern literature on the commune, kind of tracing this concept through Christian and socialist history. What else can we do, Matt, to both waste some time on this this recording and also set the stage a little better?
Right. So specifically from the Monthly Review, we're going to read an article called Socialist Communes and Anti-Imperialism, The Marxist Approach by Chris Gilbert. It is a really cool essay article about communes within the socialist framework. And okay, this is why I think it's particularly cool, and maybe the place that it picks up on the conversation that we started last week and kind of spins it out in a different direction. So last week we were kind of looking at the commune as a structure of communal management of production. And we were doing so with some texts from economists who are, not explicitly Marxist and are not thinking about real existing socialism or socialism in the 21st century or whatever, these economists are just writing about collective management and like how you could do it, and like the 8 easy cool steps that you need to become a community like this or whatever. And that's fine. But this article is a bit more, I guess, in the register that we are used to talking in that it kind of does some deep Marxology kind of stuff and looks at communes as they appear in Marx and also in Rosa Luxemburg, which is quite exciting. And then tries to make a connection from Marx towards real existing communes in socialist experiments in places like Bolivia, Venezuela, Brazil, maybe a few other places as well. And that's all super interesting. But I guess the difference between these two kinds of conversations is that last week we were talking about, like what kind of qualities do you need to have in your community to do this type of communal management? And in this conversation, it's more like what role does the state play with the commune as an institution? And, how are those things mutually reinforcing or perhaps even at odds sometimes? So kind of a different spin on communes this time around, but it's pretty cool. I think like, you get to see in this one the bigger context, the bigger questions that we didn't maybe get to talk about last time with the communes. So and this one definitely has more of a socialist flair to it, and maybe we can even kind of have some interplay here because there is a point in this article specifically that's just like, well, you can't, the commune that is not interconnected to a revolutionary movement is one that is reactionary, that is not, helpful overall. So interesting. A lot of things to talk about. Dean, let's get into the Marxology of it all. This is like the first piece of the puzzle. So many people, you read Marx, and sometimes people will split Marx up into these sort of different ages or epochs. You get the humanist Marx, you get the sort of hard economic Marx. But interestingly enough, Chris Gilbert gives us a view of Marx where he thinks that the commune is sort of a lasting institutional structure that Marx finds to be important in a socialist movement.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of section, and I guess this is where you discovered that socialists really are, I don't know, they really suffer from the same problem that all of us Christians do, which is to say, you've got to make sure there's something in the Bible before you can talk about something that you want to talk about, whether or not it's really there. And here, Chris Gilbert is paying his dues. He's going to Marx. He's going to the sacred texts and trying to locate something important. And he does, I think, a pretty convincing job of it. I'm saying that kind of playfully, but not dismissively. I think it's interesting, although, as we'll talk about, your mileage may vary. If you're a Marx nerd, it's really great. If you're not a Marx nerd, you can skip it. It's no problem. It's no big deal at all, for better or worse. But we are Marx nerds on the podcast, and in that respect, it's interesting. Chris Gilbert makes this kind of interesting study of Marx's writing where he makes the argument that whereas people do tend to divide Marx up in the way Matt just described, he wants to make a case there's more continuity in Marx's thinking. And in fact, the commune is a really key structural piece of how Marx wants to think about socialism. Some people make the argument that it kind of comes in late in Marx, so he did all the important stuff. He wrote Capital, he wrote whatever, the younger Marx stuff, all the stuff. And then later in life, toward the end, he sort of discovers or happens upon the importance of the commune. And one reason that people think that is Marx does turn a little more directly towards studying communes and also peasant and agricultural life and so on toward the end of his life. So you can understand maybe why people make that inference. But what Gilbert wants to say is there's also a lot about the commune in the Grundrisse, and which is a late work, but not it's not Capital. And then there's also some kind of talk about communes, although they're not, he uses euphemisms for them or other terms in Capital itself. And then kind of throughout Marx's career, he seems really interested in this particular form of people coming together. And the basics of it is that for Marx, you don't necessarily need this sort of like big capitalist system that sorts everything out, and then you turn it into a communist one, which is kind of the like textbook way of reading Marx. But instead, the communes themselves that are already appearing kind of on the fringes of capitalist development in places like Russia at the time, but also in the Americas and India and Algeria, the experience of peasant life and community life was an experience of resistance to capitalist expropriation and kind of the dissolution of community ties and so on. And it was also a site of potential. So, one thing Gilbert talks about is that Marx isn't saying we should just preserve peasant communalism or whatever against, I don't know, socialism or capitalism or whatever you might say. But on the contrary, in the experience of kind of peasant communities and other kinds of communal experiments, especially agricultural ones, there was a lot of possibility for laying the groundwork for a kind of more socialist transformation as long as it's tied to a revolution. And I mean, I think whether or not Marx has like some deep continuity that's dedicated to figuring out the commune for him, I kind of don't care. I think if you want it to be there, you can let Gilbert convince you that it's there. If you don't want it to be there, you can, I don't know, write a paper about it. But I do think that it's fun to kind of stylize Marx as a person thinking about the commune for him and trying to see potentiality within the commune. So I don't know. I think for the fun of it alone, it's worth reading. What do you think, Matt? Is Marx a big commune guy? Does it matter?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm oblivious to like whether or not the Marxology is just right. I mean, Gilbert like knows more about Marx than I do. I will stake that claim and unashamedly. That's fine. This is a real academic who has done their homework, so that's cool. I'm sold on the idea. I think it's cool. And I think it is cool because there's a real I feel like, okay, you read Marx and you get all kinds of like, great information about the way that classes push against other classes, the way that labor works and exploitation works and alienation works, all these kinds of big ideas. And the theory of revolution in Marx, though, is like, I don't want to say it's like lacking, but oftentimes the bits that you get like in the Communist Manifesto or in other, letters from Marx is sometimes like vague, and you don't really know what is the institution that workers can build, that the proletariat can build, that can really fight back or something against capitalism, or that, after sort of abolishing capitalism or, whatever, revolting against it, what is the institution that workers can build to sort of like keep to protect the ongoing revolution? And the answer is the commune. And I think it's cool to see how this kind of starts to come out in some places in Marx that maybe you wouldn't initially see, but once you kind of get the idea, it's hard not to see it, I guess. It shows up in a few different places, according to Gilbert, like in the Grundrisse, and the place that I thought was like most interesting, like some of these are really deep cuts in Marx, so it's like you need somebody like Gilbert to really point these out to you. But for example, he says that the clearest explanation and like study of the communal formation, the commune, is in some of the things that Marx wrote in a letter about the the peasant commune in Russia. And so it's in this letter that he wrote to the editorial board of a newspaper, and also it is in the 1882 preface to the Russian translation of the Communist Manifesto. Interestingly enough, as Gilbert points out, that preface to the Communist Manifesto was written by Engels, and Marx just, gave it the thumbs up. So these two really important bits about the commune, one of them not written by Marx, and the other one is written in a letter that Marx wrote to a newspaper. Just kind of like wild, deep cuts. I'm so grateful someone else is doing this work out there. It's very cool. Anyways, Gilbert writes this: in these documents, Marx took the time to sketch out how a commune with collective ownership and some degree of internal self-government could fit into a strategy of socialist transition and national liberation in a peripheral country. One issue was the productive forces. Marx argued that the commune had to incorporate the technological achievements of the capitalist system, for which he felt the Russian commune was particularly well suited, as a late communal form was not based mainly on kinship, and it was capable of broader development. A second issue was that the communes needed to be connected among each other. According to Marx, it was a debilitating feature that the existing общиnas, that's like the Russian peasant commune, were localized microcosms, and even suggested that their isolation was the natural basis for despotism. And then third, there had to be a political revolution that would transform the existing state and establish a new relation to the communes that was essentially a process of national liberation. Very interesting observations that you get from Marx and Engels on this stuff, about, the existing types of socialism in the world, or the existing types of at least communal structures in the world, and how, they're cool, but they would need sort of to be improved upon, to be really revolutionary, and to even have sort of a stronger stance against the ever encroaching, capitalist mode of production or whatever in the 1870s and 1880s. But it's a cool explanation of, like, I guess, where Marx's head is at around some of the stuff, that it's like it's a part of the socialist strategy, but it is, I think in the contemporary socialist discourse, it is in the global north, the contemporary socialist discourse in the global north, it is not part of the conversation. And that's too bad. We should bring it back. I don't know. The monastery is cool, but we need the big outstretched communal structure that can help us really figure this whole thing out.
Yeah, there's also been a lot of interesting stuff at the monthly review, but elsewhere too, on how Marxist studies of the commune and how it appears in different societies kind of opens Marxism up to thinking in a non-Eurocentric way, or at least a less Eurocentric way, maybe. There was a lot published in the monthly review over the last even 5 years or so on Marxism and indigenous ways of thinking and being. And there was a lot of kind of cool engagement with Marx's late work and the stuff he was looking at in terms of indigenous communities in North America and Latin America. Lots of stuff that I guess I didn't know that Marx cared about until somebody had to tell me that. So that's all really fascinating. And I think also creates the conditions for having another conversation about Marxism and, what is it capable of opening up, and what does it also need to kind of open it up more. And lots of cool engagement with Marx from indigenous scholars. Glenn Coulthard here in Canada has done some interesting work on all that. All that to say, I think that there's something really cool about pulling out Marx's attention to communes. It kind of lets you diversify Marxism as a tradition of thinking, and also a tradition of thinking about socialism beyond just either the Soviet Union or industrial countries or whatever. And I think that is really fascinating, especially if you're interested in something like liberation theology. Liberation theologians themselves were trying to I think in a certain way intuit what Marx was saying when they were putting together base communities and doing literacy campaigns among peasants. There was this sense that it's not just the so-called working class that is the only engine of social change, or maybe it has a unique relationship to capital that you can intervene in through the strike or through other kinds of organized means, but there's lots of stuff going on outside of the capital and proletarian relationship, and maybe there are kind of seeds of social change that are already planted in those other kind of organized ways of doing human community. So I think there's a lot going for that kind of expanded reading of Marx, and trying to locate the commune for him in his thought, even if like I said, your mileage may vary. You don't have to be a Marx nerd to think all that's cool. There are other people who think about it, but it's cool to internally expand the Marxist tradition in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, here, let me give you some more Marx nerd content. I know that I know that you want it. Not only do you see some of the commune content creep up in this extremely niche historical notes, Gilbert says that you can see some of this thinking bubbling up in maybe a less obvious way in the Grundrisse. So the Grundrisse is something that Marx wrote before Capital, and it's just the notes basically that he would use later for Capital. It's not something that he had written that he had ever intended people to actually read and study, but Marx nerds are going to Marx nerd, and that's what people do with them for sure. Yeah, I don't know. The Grundrisse, if you have a big like anthology or collection of Marx's writings or whatever, the Grundrisse is always in there, so you can read it yourself. It's not as long as Capital, obviously, but Gilbert points out that Marx posited communal exchange as the fundamental antithesis of commodity exchange. Okay, this is kind of an interesting point that Gilbert makes. So he says that early in the Grundrisse, in the chapter on money, Marx lays out the social nature of value. He observes how in contemporary society, exchange value expresses the social nexus. It embodies the mutual and general dependence of individuals who have nothing to do with each other except as private producers connected through the market. Exchange value is a social nexus that confronts the individual as something alien and object-like. Because of this object-like character, Marx concludes that this social connection between persons is transformed into a social relation between things. Yet Marx immediately perceives that the communal bond is the fundamental antithesis of the situation. There is an inverse relation, he observes, between community control and the rule of value. This is a direct quote here. The less social power the medium of exchange possesses, the greater must be the power of the community. Here Marx is juxtaposing two essential contrary systems, the capitalist system on the one hand and the communal system on the other. I think this is kind of cool because there's evidence here to, that Marx is not thinking, I guess, on the individual level. And if you're kind of thinking about this in terms of like, I don't know, dialectics or whatever, right? You have the individualism of commodity exchange on the one hand, and then the answer being sort of the communal exchange on the other. And, what type of, social institution would you need to support the communal exchange or the communal production? A commune. So you see some of this like laid out in these different forms that are maybe less obvious than just like talking about, who does the dishes on what night of the commune or whatever, but kind of interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, and I think too, maybe it's good to pause and say a little bit more even about what a commune is and how that differs from the way we talk about community sometimes, because you might think, for example, like I come from a rural community in northern Michigan, and people love talking about community there, and that's cool. It has community for sure. It's like a tight-knit place, for better and for worse, all that kind of stuff. But it would be wrong to be like, well, the seeds of socialism can come out of like a rural community just by virtue of the fact that it's kind of like isolated as a community or difficult to get there or get out of it, etc. When Marx is talking about a commune, he is talking about something that has like a relationship to reproduction, like economic reproduction. So it's based on subsistence. It's capable of kind of doing its thing, governing itself, taking care of its resources in the way that we talked about the commons in previous episodes in a lot of ways. So I think that is interesting. And it kind of begs the question of like, okay, so most of us don't live in things that could be reasonably construed as communes if you grew up in a capitalist society. Capitalism has done a pretty good job of destroying those things, eating them away. Marx is writing about this in the 1800s, but here we are in the 2000s, and guess what we lost? Capitalism has done a pretty good job of eating all that stuff out. Eating all that stuff away. But the big problem, I mean, and also I guess not totally or absolutely, right? Like there's lots of places in the world, especially the global south, where that story is more complicated. But in the global north, I think, that's the situation we're in. So how do you then kind of apply this stuff, or like what's the relevance of all that commune thinking for thinking through the way you might like relate to a socialist project? And I think that's where something Gilbert does is really interesting. He goes through a number of modern projects, which we'll talk about in a minute. He talks about Venezuela, Brazil, some other places. But he also points to Rosa Luxemburg as a person who's trying to like bridge some of this gap. So she too, like Marx, was very interested in communes and communal structures. And Gilbert notes that she wouldn't have had access to Marx's later writings or where some of this stuff is coming out. So he kind of makes this argument that she shares an intuition with Marx. And she too is kind of looking through history and society to find like different examples of where people have kind of hit on the idea of communal sharing, communal management of resources and goods. And she too concludes that maybe that's the kind of source of potential for both socialism and resistance to capitalism, because you find that stuff again on like the frontiers of capital. And I think that's really fascinating because, like, we've talked in the past about Luxemburg's interest in early Christian literature and kind of identifying the promise of communism in the Book of Acts, but also the kind of limitations of it. So, in the Book of Acts, everybody is sharing their stuff, and that's cool. You sell your possessions, you share everything you have. So, you consume everything in common. But Luxemburg points out that there's kind of a math problem there because at some point, you're going to have to produce stuff because you have to keep on consuming. And so you've got to find like a more sustainable form of socialism. And I think what Luxemburg is doing is trying to figure out what would be those kind of sustainable forms of socialism hanging around, and how could you like build a socialist project out of all that stuff. And the big key for Gilbert is that once you start asking that question, you also end up in a kind of anti-imperialist framework, whether you try to get there or not, I guess, because it's the imperialist nature of capitalism that's like eroding all the interesting possible experiments happening around the world, or the kind of communities that you need to build something different. And I think there's a lot of cool stuff to be said there. I don't really know how to square that with how Luxemburg looks at Christian communes, but I don't know. Feels like there's an intuition there waiting to be sorted out.
Yeah, I agree with you. Gilbert, goes out of his way to say that, Luxemburg is like Marx, looking at these sort of agrarian communities and looking at the ways that those communal structures, the communist institutions, arise out of them. And it does become sort of an anti-imperialist type of endeavor because, it's done, to push back against the frontiers of capitalist expansion. But yeah, a really interesting observation. It is the confluence of those two people, Luxemburg and Marx, kind of focusing on the commune as a structure of like proto-communist thought or formation or what organization or whatever, is super interesting, especially in Luxemburg. Like, is the way that Gilbert explains it. It's like, she's looking for these like traces of communism through history, and the way that she talks about it, it seems like it's kind of just like wondering, like, what does this new exploration of this historical communist moment or whatever afford us now? Like, what is it that we can learn from it?
Mm-hmm.
How do we build on these things? And there's kind of like, I don't know, a dual-edgedness about this, where on the one hand, the anti-imperialism part is about the ways that the communal structure is there, and it helps like protect those communal ties of, like, for better and for worse, from being completely annihilated by capitalist expansion. And then they do get annihilated. But it's interesting how there's sort of like a forward lookingness about it, where it's like, how can we use these things to think about these types of institutions in our own society, but also looking at them historically to think about how they've like protected a particular way of life that may, I guess there's like a little bit of a conservative element in like the big conservative way of thinking, where you're literally trying to protect a particular way of life against some type of outside force that isn't always bad. An anti-colonial way of thinking, I guess, that is trying to protect a way of life. Very cool, though.
Right.
I think it's interesting to think about the stuff that she's written about Christianity in that context. But like you said, I don't really know what to make of it quite yet. It is like, as we've talked about in other episodes, like the early Christian communities were anti-imperialist. I mean, by definition. So I guess that kind of fits the bill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Well, there's a lot of interesting things to say about the history piece of it. Maybe one last thing to note is he also talks about Jose Carlos Mariátegui, who is a Peruvian socialist who also did all this really interesting stuff on indigenous life in Latin America and indigenous kind of socialism and so on. And coincidentally, his son went to school with Gustavo Gutierrez, a really fun liberation theology connection. Anyway, that guy had done a lot of really cool stuff, similarly thinking through the connections between anti-imperialism, the commune forum, and how socialism would come about. And he, living in Latin America, didn't have any illusion that you'd have to wait around for like capitalism to figure out your country before you did socialism. So lots of interesting things that he's kind of weaving together here. Chris Gilbert is. But again, I guess that question of like, so what do you do with all that stuff? The history is cool. Looking at history is fun. But again, we don't really live in those kinds of commune situations anymore. And that's where Gilbert starts to look at these more contemporary projects. So he does a pretty interesting analysis of the MST, the landless workers movement in Brazil. He also talks about the Zapatistas and what he calls neo-Zapatismo in some interesting ways that maybe we could talk about in a minute. But the big thing that he wants to talk through is the experiment in Venezuela with Chavez and the Commune Forum. He also wrote a really interesting book, a longer book called Commune or Nothing, which came out from Monthly Review, I don't know, like a year or 2 years ago. It's pretty recent. But it's a good book. I have it and have read parts of it, but not all of it. But lots of really cool stuff on like how the commune structure works in Venezuela. And I guess it's probably worth pointing out that he lives and teaches in Venezuela. So that's significant. A person who's very invested, obviously, in the project. But it's cool to kind of figure out. So there's all this insight that the commune is maybe the key to building a sustainable socialist revolution. But exactly what commune and how do you kind of bet it on the commune when you don't already live in one is a question that I think is like hard to solve. And Gilbert's argument is that it is being solved in projects like the Bolivarian Revolution, the Venezuelan Revolution. Maybe to put it really briefly, and then we can expand it out. What Gilbert argues is the Venezuelan experiment kind of understands that the commune is the key cell to building a socialist society. But that commune has to be, first of all, kind of brought into being. Like it's not just there to be invested in. And that means the commune has to kind of take on responsibilities around the social reproduction of life, mutual aid, helping people out. It has a certain defined geographical territory, etc. But those communes also have to be linked in a purposeful way to a revolutionary project and the state. And there has to be this kind of like mediation between the state and the commune. And something Gilbert talks about too is that mediation is not always smooth. Like it's not like just because the communes are there and the state in theory agrees with the commune structure, that is, that the communes and the state therefore have the same ideas or same ideology or the same perspective on the revolution. There's a kind of dialogue process that happens. And he says too that the commune process has had to kind of learn its own ideology over time, just like the revolutionary state. So lots of interesting things that can happen in between all of that. But I think that is such a like really, really interesting kind of political science point, I guess, that, like once you find the like weird historical trivia about Marx intriguing, where you're like, okay, there's something cool about socialism being born in the commune, then the kind of next natural question is to be like, is that just trivia or can that insight still be activated? And what would you have to do that on purpose? And to point to Venezuela as like one way of doing that, I think is really interesting. It helps you feel like you're not just learning weird historical trivia that you could never achieve, but rather like all this stuff was being put together by Marx because he felt like he should start thinking about that to change society. And similarly, people in the global South in particular are still trying to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Gilbert writes this kind of about Venezuela and the building up towards the commune. The now 25-year-old Venezuelan revolution has found ways to spiral up in a process of creative invention and implicit self-critique. In fact, nothing could better illustrate the commune building as part of the comprehensive anti-imperialist and socialist strategy of the kind that Marx would endorse than the way of the Bolivarian process. then the way the Bolivarian process has accumulated definitions. Always good to explain all the Marx stuff and then be like, and this is the kind of thing that Marx would be really into. um, key for a socialist argument. It's good stuff. Anyways, he's right. It's fine. And he goes on to say, it became anti-imperialist in 2004, then incorporated socialism in 2006, then began using communes as the basic cells of its anti-imperialist socialist project in 2009 and 2010. Notably, at the very moment that Chavez proposed communes as the building blocks of socialism, he also warded off any idea of an autonomous communal project by indicating that the isolated commune was counter-revolutionary. Further, in the next year, the government put into law the idea that communes should be connected through communal cities, federations, and finally the communal state. I know that's kind of a lot to read, but I think it is important to see that that quote spiraling up of a process of the socialist state. It doesn't just all kind of like start at one point or whatever, and it's a done deal, but they're building it over time. And then, the communes kind of come in because that's that's the strategy, but it becomes enshrined in law and not just like a thing that exists within the state, but it is like the key component of the state. And that is pretty unique, I think. Maybe, if not unique, it is like a strategy that you don't see in other iterations of, like the Soviet Union or something. Quite different, a different form of communal state or transitionary socialism or whatever.
It's interesting because also enshrining it into law that way gives the communes both a form of like relation to the state that's obvious. The state affirms that they exist and then creates a kind of pathway by which to do that, I guess.
Yeah.
But it also affords the communes a bit more autonomy too, in a maybe paradoxical way, where they can seize on those rights recognized by the law and have done so. Something Gilbert talks about in the book, Commune or Nothing, is that, Chavez was really like betting it all on the communes. And then the Maduro government has kind of had like, I guess, better and worse relations to the communes in general over time. He talks about how, like, Venezuela is going through a big crisis, and so the government has had many strategies. And also, the government is not just like Maduro, like whatever Maduro says is what the government does. There's a plurality of voices within the PSUV, the Socialist Party, and that creates different strategies for development and so on, and survival and anti-imperialism, etc. And Gilbert says that the communes at different times have had to kind of advocate for themselves with respect to the government. And his reading, at least by this point, is that that process has ultimately kind of worked out in the communes' favor. Like the government kind of came back around and was like, yeah, this is probably the way to do it. But he says in part that's also because the communes not only made a persuasive case, they also have been continuing to prove themselves as like the key unit for economic survival in Venezuela. So even in the midst of like an insane economic crisis and, like bonkers, like it just wild inflation, all this kind of stuff, scarcity, the communes have been the kind of the means by which people have, guaranteed their economic lives, through mutual aid, through production, etc. So there's something really interesting about that as well, that through the government kind of affirming the commune structure, it gives the communes also a kind of legal backing to like keep forcing the Bolivarian revolution to become more and more communal, even in a state of like prolonged economic crisis, which I think is really fascinating. Like it's not just that the commons are resilient, as we talked about in the last episode, where, the more you manage the commons, the better the kind of natural resource use will inevitably be. But the commune itself is resilient. Like the commune form is the kind of thing that's hard to like give up or get rid of.
Yeah. Yeah, very interesting. A later section also kind of draws some parallels from Chavismo and the communes in Venezuela to also communal projects in Bolivia and in Brazil. The MST in Brazil, famously occupying land, as a big part of that social movement. And then in the Bolivian process, there's also like a really wide support where the government supports like, the indigenous people and their social movements. So there's these other aspects in which these types of communal projects uh, pick up a lot of that same um, commune vibes, I guess, from elsewhere, and it ends up becoming like pretty central to their expressions of socialism in the world. There's, I mean, I guess a lot to say about the MST and about Bolivia and the ways that these strategies were really important in freeing Lula, in Brazil, and then getting him elected as president and everything else. I don't know, Dean. What do you want to say about those things?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even if your state doesn't affirm the commune, the movements that are commune based nevertheless seem to kind of spiderweb themselves out in such a broad way and kind of also form enough activists and so on that you can really get things done. And I think that's where like the kind of emerging lessons are coming from the global south on how to think about the commune form. I think about like in North America, for whatever reason, it's like harder to find those. Like there's so many like think pieces and articles about the disappearance of third spaces and like people are so atomized and it's hard to make friends and you don't have like a natural community or neighborhood or whatever. And I think that makes it like harder to kind of figure out, well, how do you do that kind of stuff? Like how do you form a commune? But it seems to me like that's where people who go to church have like kind of a leg up. The church is not a commune. It's not the MST, but it also, historically has been the space where people do come and kind of meet together, take on communal projects, air their grievances, think politically, decide to do something about their communities, that kind of thing. And I think that a lot of church communities still end up being essential spaces for that to happen. Even with like declining religious attendance and stuff, like where do you go get food or clothes or whatever? It's often still at like a church. Whether or not people go to that church on Sunday, who knows? But it's still like a place that's recognized as a place to kind of have your needs met. And I feel like there's like room for Christianity in the North, especially to sort of think that stuff through again with attention to the South. Like the base community experiments of liberation theology was to say, could you have a kind of community that is plugged into a local church, maybe a parish, maybe a couple of parishes, but also has an autonomous life of its own? It's a community that kind of collects a handful of people together. It's not exactly church, but it's not really not church either. It's this kind of like extra space where Christians of goodwill are kind of hanging out and thinking about how to kind of change their societies. And it feels like maybe there's a model there for something like the global north. I don't think like church communes are going to be, the revolutionary cells of like First World Revolution or something like that. I mean, optimistically, who knows? Feels like maybe an untapped evangelization strategy. But I think there's something there at least of saying like, churches nevertheless do something kind of like what communes could do. And like, what if we just did that more on purpose? That's like the neo-monasticism we need. People who are like not retreating necessarily to like a neighborhood, but kind of, I don't know, seizing the means of religious production, and being like, all right, we're going to turn this into a kind of social, I don't know, socially engaged community, or figure out how that relates to the political movements around us. Lots of churches already do that, but there's a lot of untapped kind of potential there, I think. And that sort of revolutionary theory of the commune also maybe helps figure out like what's the possible political activation of those sort of like spaces where people associate.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking some similar ideas. Okay. The idea that I kept coming back to throughout this essay was kind of about Richard Gilman-Opalsky's book, The Communism of Love. In that book, his argument is like, well, communism is an expression of a particular type of love, like expanding out from, our interpersonal relationships outward and kind of like growing that type of concern and care and connection to other people. And the commune seems like, a political and social expression of that type of love, even if, we don't have to feel like sentimentally attached to all these other people, but, the commune does connect you in a way that, is different than the atomized sort of space of work or whatever. And it did make me think a lot about church and the way that those types of communities can breed that particular type of sociality, where you're, feeling a deeper type of connection to people who you really have no other connection to. And maybe that's something kind of interesting. Like you said, Dean, it's probably not like the future is not the church commune or whatever, but but also it's like, it does exist within the constellation of those types of organizations in the world. And yeah, I don't know, it's probably not the soul the soul saving grace or whatever, but it is like a part of that connective tissue that I think is missing in so many people's lives. And it can help, build those communities and build those connections, even if you're not really like going for theological reasons or whatever. Churches can be great sort of connecting points within communities that, we probably shouldn't overlook, in terms of what the future of our social movements look like. Yeah, I don't know. A lot of big feelings and ideas about these things. The other thought I did have too about all of this. This is a less churchy thought, so if that's not your vibe, then you can tune back in right now. I was thinking about the way that the article from last week talked about communes as, like a way to sort of manage a commons, and isn't that interesting? But it was talking about it sort of free from the hangups of political ideology, which I mean, remarkably strange if you really think about it. Because like if you did that or whatever, would capitalism let you? And in some ways yes, and in some ways no. I'm in the UK. There's a really vibrant, I don't know, maybe vibrant isn't the right word, but there is a handful of people who are really interested in the idea of a co-op, which is not a commune, but is also, borrowing some ideas from a type of commune. And it makes me think too that like if you really wanted to start some kind of communal production in your community, there's a way to frame it that's just like you're really just being like a disruptor in the marketplace. You're being like there's a really entrepreneurial spirit to it that I think you could play up to get people really excited about it, and like get like a government grant or something, maybe, I don't know. But just a lot of different aspects, I guess, that I'm thinking about in terms of like how do you build the commune within a capitalist economy, and sort of like use that as a leverage point or as a fulcrum or something to do more. Anyways, a lot of disconnected weird ideas floating around in my brain about it right now, but that's what I've got.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's fascinating about looking at the commune and looking at things like the Venezuelan experiment is that I think it helps to, I don't know, not get rid of, but maybe like relativize or sideline some of the debate between like left communists and state communists and whatever, like, because there is this entrepreneurial side to the commune that sort of like bets it on a local engagement, right? Local community, and you're really kind of investing in the people around you. You're taking on a common task, etc. And that's the kind of thing that like left communist people and anarchists and other people on the left really like. And I feel, like it's hard not to have a soft spot for that, because like who doesn't like, I don't know, having a say in what happens in your neighborhood or like doing something really fun with other people. And on the other hand, though, there's a recognition that the state is a really important institution to guarantee the longevity and livelihood of those kinds of things. And I think that sometimes the playfulness of kind of commune ideologies or like a left communist ideology or anarchist ideology, the playfulness of it always kind of begs the question of like, but how serious can something like that get for everybody else? Like if you're kind of a goofy person, you can get into it, which no shade to that. I think that's great. Everybody should be a little bit goofy. Like that's fine with me. But the state kind of allows an expansion of the fruits of that kind of communal idea to, I guess, be more absorbable by like average folks, or you can kind of like find your way into it. And it seems to me that that's kind of what happens in a lot of Venezuelan communes. There are some that are extremely politically left-wing, there are like communes named after Che Guevara or whatever. But there are also communes that are just more like barrio associations, like kind of neighborhood hangouts, and people go there because that's where you talk about politics and figure out what's going on in your community and sort it out. And it strikes me that like all that stuff kind of sidelines the need to like insist on a total negation of the state on the one hand, or like a total, like overbearing top-down planned system, centrally planned system on the other hand. So there's something really fascinating about all that. And I think that what's helpful there is it also gives you a little bit of room to imagine like, well, how would you, like, you don't have to wait around for the big revolution to happen tomorrow. But you also don't have to like retreat into like, the handful of, I don't know, weird anarchist houses that you live in with your friends or whatever. And that's kind of the extent of your political activity. Like there are more options on the table, and I think that is a pretty interesting one, the kind of like commune socialist experiment.
Yeah, it definitely does give everybody a little something to do, Everyone can be in their lane. Um, the more socialists with the state, the anarchists with all the communes, it's great. Yeah, it does make me feel too like there's a definitely like there's a more productive conversation I think to have about communism and anarchism in that type of framework than you get in like, yeah, just the same old kind of Bakunin Marx conversations that you have time and time again or whatever about whether or not you should put on the one ring of power or whatever, or you should throw it into the fires of Mount Doom. It's like, it seems like a more dynamic conversation about like the way forward, into a socialist future, and how you navigate some of those real tensions in terms of a state facilitating the existence of communes and communes seizing like a real type of independence and self-determination. I think these are great vibes to continue figuring out, and like just a better conversation than just like, I don't know, but does the state mean that everything is actually bad or something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess when it comes to kind of thinking through the Christian left too, it helps to mediate that impulse we've talked about the last few weeks, where some Christians are trying to like drop out of capitalism altogether by forming like a small intentional community. And I think that is cool. Like I would never say that, I don't know, those people are bad or you shouldn't do that. But it kind of begs all these other questions around how to engage politically. And I think that these kinds of theories just maybe help recover or like help figure out what to do with progressive Christianity that pushes it toward a revolutionary end. So like, I don't know, forming those kind of communities, I think is actually really interesting. Forming alternative communities, dropping out of the system, whatever. But they have to be kind of tied in to a political project that extends beyond the church as well, or like can dialogue with people who, are motivated for reasons other than going to church, which some Christians are very good at doing, I think, in those alternative community spaces, and others are not, in my experience. But I think it's that kind of like, if you were going to have a recovery of the monastic impulse today, like in this form of capitalism, it would have to take the form of also figuring out how does the kind of monastic experiment not only be a dropping out of the world, but a kind of intentional creation of nodes that are trying to like, deepen a revolutionary process or start one or relate to one or whatever, whatever the context might be. But the monastic impulse, ironically, has to be like a necessarily connected one in a weird sort of way. And I think that kind of commune socialism, there's room to figure out how that kind of feeds into those intuitions that some Christians on the left have.
Thanks for listening to Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you support us at $1 or more, you get an invite to our cool Discord channel, the Discord commune, for sure. There's all kinds of great people in there having conversations about Hollow Knight Silksong, everyone's new favorite video game, and recent episodes and organizing and all kinds of things. It's a cool community to be a part of. All kinds of interesting things come of it, reading groups, whatever. People are still in there reading the Bible even together. Amazing. Our intro music is by Mario Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
Get up for church